Hello, BookTube. I'm Jonathan, and today we are here to rank The Dark Tower from best to worst. And in order to do that, I've recruited some BookTube friends and some fellow Dark Tower readers. Josh from Red Fury Books. Are you excited to talk about some Stephen King? I know you're a big fan.
I'm always excited to talk about Stephen King. Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Nice. And Joanna, you're one of the people that convinced me to read this series, and which I very much appreciate. I'm sure you got some spicy Dark Tower takes for us.
I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so grateful that you went ahead and read the Dark Tower series based on my recommendation. Can't wait to hear your thoughts.
It's been an epic journey. Hopefully this is an epic video. We'll see whether we agree or disagree which were our favorites or least favorites. We're going to talk about them in a spoiler-free fashion as much as we can, and things get interesting. There's sci-fi, horror, fantasy, multiverse, time travel. There's something for everyone in this book or this series. Starting with the first book, we're going to go through them in order. The Gunslinger. Josh, tell us what you liked or didn't like about The Gunslinger. Where does it rank?
So I have to preface this by I guarantee that it's been the longest for me from reading every one of these books. I read the first three books in 1991 when The Wastelands came
Wow.
out. So
Nice.
the beauty of BookTube, though, is over the last few years, I've been watching people do kind of spoiler free reviews of everything, and it's brought back all the memories. And I realized I remember so much of it just because King is such a vivid author. As for the Gunslinger itself, what I remember most about reading it is that I didn't like it. And my
Mm.
grandmother, who is the one that got me into Stephen King in the first place, she said, "You have to keep going. You have to read The Drawing of the Three," which I'll talk about in a minute. But as far as the Gunslinger, the things that when I reflect back upon it that make it one of my lower ranked books here is I think it's neither representative of the series or of Stephen King as an author. And it's just very, very different. I did read just a little bit of it in the last week, just in preparation for this, and it just feels so different.
Interesting.
It does have the best opening line of any Stephen King book, though. The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. You can't beat that. I mean, that's great. But as far as ranking goes, I have the gunslinger slotted in at number 6 for me.
Number 6. Interesting. A little bit of wiggle room there. And good advice from your grandma, too. We'll get to the next book, but solid advice from Josh's grandma so far. Joanna, what did you think of The Gunslinger?
I um I like Josh, I was not crazy about this book when I read it, and part of that had to do with expectation. I picked this book up I'm trying to think of the year. It might have been 2018, 2019, but I picked it up after years and years of prompting from my brother. I come from a family of King fans, and my one of my
Nice.
brothers kept on telling me for over a decade, "You need to read the Dark Tower series." But he kept on pitching it to me as fantasy, and at the time when I picked it up, I hadn't read much fantasy, or I hadn't read fantasy in a long time. So when I had a very narrow view of what the genre was at the time I picked it up. And so I was thinking like medieval castles, swords, sorcery, courts, that kind of thing, and not necessarily a futuristic dystopian Western setting.
Yeah.
And not focusing on just one, mainly one character. I guess we do focus on a couple of others as we go on in this particular book. And I thought it was okay, but I was not crazy about it. I didn't feel compelled to read on immediately after reading The Gunslinger. And I'm so glad I did later on, but it was not the highest of highs for me. And I think I, like Josh, I'm not just copying Josh, I promise, but I'm putting this at my number 6 ranking as well.
Number 6 slot. And it seems like this series is a bit of a family affair. We got Josh's grandma giving recommendations, Joanna's brother. I guess you guys are my family. You're my family giving me Dark Tower recommendations. I'm going to agree with you guys. I was intrigued by the opening of this book, and I liked aspects of it, but I found it was a little dry, it was a little slow, it was a little confusing. Although I did like the ending. There was a bit of an interaction, a discussion towards the end, which kind of leans into some science slash sci-fi territory, which is kind of my comfort food. So while I didn't think it was the strongest, it did at least intrigue me enough to keep going with the series, and I had been told and agree with the first book isn't really representative of the style or quality of The Dark Tower. For me, it was actually number 7. I'm putting it in that bottom slot. So We're all somewhat in agreement, although you guys liked a book less than The Gunslinger. We'll have to find out what that is. We're going to move on now to the second book in the series, The Drawing of the Three. We'll kind of boomerang this around, maybe. Joanna, what did you think of The Drawing of the Three?
I loved the drawing of the three. I loved it because we get introduced to a couple of key characters in the series that end up forming a found family. So, as I mentioned, the first book did not hit the fantasy checkboxes I had in my mind for a narrow view of what the genre was. But as you go on, you start to see those elements combine more and more. And so I'll never forget how excited I was when I met these characters. And as much as I said I wanted more of like I think a traditional type of fantasy story when I read book 1, or that was what I was in the mood for or expecting. I actually really love the direction that book 3 took. It actually introduced more urban fantasy elements, I would say. We get some bits of alternate time periods. I mean, it's time travel, but not necessarily in a typical time travel way. And
Yeah.
so all those things were very exciting for me. I enjoyed this book so much. And the hard part is ranking this because honestly, we're after this, we're gonna talk about book 3. For me, books 2 and 3 are on equal level with each other. I would put them in the same place. I could easily one day put one above the other. I think they're very, very similar for me as far as my enjoyment being really high for both. But I guess just for the purpose of this type of video, I'll go ahead and rank this at number 2 because it was such a
Mm,
dramatic contrast, and I really, really loved what King did with the characters and the found family element, the quartet that comes together.
nice. Joanna's high on it. Again, leaving a little bit of wiggle room. The number one and number seven are still open and available to you. Josh, what did you think of The Drawing of the Three?
So, very similar. I really love this book, and King has often been said that this is kind of his homage to Lord of the Rings, and in many ways, Drawing of the Three is Fellowship of the Ring, which of the Lord of the Rings, that's my favorite of the three. I just love seeing
Interesting.
the characters come together, and even though the full quartet isn't formed here, um, we get we get the two of the very very important players here. The other thing that I remember very vividly about Drawing a Three, and I don't know why people don't talk about it as much, is there's a just a horrible villain in Drawing of the Three in one of the timelines, just total psychopath. And I don't think that maybe because in the grand scheme of the series, this villain isn't as important as kind of the entire trajectory of the Dark Tower, but King writes a really great villain in there. And I love the multiverse implications here. There's a particular scene I won't give away for spoilers, but that showcases King's descriptive powers are just supreme in this book. But Drawing of the Three, I'm glad again that I listened to my grandmother and continued. I ranked it at number 3.
Number three, interesting. All right, so for me, this was where I really got to be impressed by Stephen King's writing, become familiar with his skills as a character writer. Because as someone starting with Stephen King with The Dark Tower, I got a little taste of that in The Gunslinger, but this is the book where I fell in love with his writing style, the characters. It's an interesting journey, it's an adventure. We're bringing these themes together, we're bringing these characters together. I was very much on board with it. I'm in a similar spot to you guys. I'm going to rank the Drawing of the Three as number 3. So Josh and I are in alignment. So that takes us to book 3. Josh.
So I had to glance down. I jotted down a couple notes because I remember reading The Drawing of the Three and The Wastelands back to back. So there were aspects of
Thank
it
you for
that I
jumping in, by the way, while I forgot what the name of book 3 was. I appreciate it.
yeah, and I couldn't remember a couple of the facts, and that's why I remembered that even though I think of Drawing a Three as kind of the Fellowship really comes together, including a certain animal companion that appears in this book that
Oh,
is
of
is one of
course,
my
of course.
favorites in literature. Um, Another just really really strong one, and I think it's the narrative and the where it ended. It's interesting because both 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 have something that kind of almost straddles the book, and at the end of, I don't want to give it away, but there's a certain inanimate object that you see at the end of 3 that is a huge part of the beginning of 4 that I find so compelling. And I love the Wastelands. And I think, Joanna, I think we probably have them flipped because I have the Wastelands as number two.
Yeah. And I could
Interesting.
easily switch that on any day because I actually was struggling with this before this discussion because that thing you're talking about towards the end of the Wastelands is so good. It was such a bold choice and it worked so well. The Wastelands also, we actually get a quest narrative in this one, and you really see that Stephen King loved some Tolkien because you do see some Lord of the Rings influences in this book and Hobbit influences as well in the Wastelands. So I really loved that. I loved the quest journey, and I also really appreciated, I don't know, just different stopping points along the way as well. You start to find out more to this, I guess, multiverse. I guess I could say that, right? Spoiler free. And I really enjoyed it. And I would say that this book does end on a cliffhanger. It accelerates towards the end. That's the other thing I'll say
Yeah.
about book 3. So
Right.
yes, this is my number 3 ranking, but could easily switch with number
Yeah.
2.
Number three. So that makes sense to me because I also found the drawing of the three and the Wastelands to be of similar style, similar quality. I liked some of the same things. I think it expanded on some things, and I really liked the ending. If I were to nitpick, I felt like in the middle of the book, it progresses towards something that it tells you is going to happen on the back of the book in the blurb. So I felt
Oh,
like that dragged a little. That's the risk of reading. Once you get into a series, don't read blurbs. The blurbs are doing you no favors at that point. And then, as you alluded to, there's a little bit of walking and talking, which maybe might appeal to you guys as fantasy fans a little bit more than me as the sci-fi guy. I didn't mind it because I like the characters, but I was maybe eager to move at a little faster pace than perhaps you were. So I did also enjoy The Wastelands, but I'm going to go one below, and I'm going to rank it number 4. So, speaking of the number 4, book 4, Wizard and Glass. Joanna, what were your thoughts?
I love this book so much. Where do I begin? We get this whole entire and real development of an alternate Western world in this one. We also get a story within a story. And I know a lot of people who, when they were reading this series, were not fond of that device in this particular book because it doesn't really accelerate you in the present timeline with the characters. But for me, this is the book that deeply emotionally attached me to the characters. And what I love about a story within a story in general is the idea that you feel like you're not only given a story as a reader, but you feel like you're present there with the other characters who are listening to the story. And that's how I felt when I read this particular book. And it's just an incredible adventure story. There's forbidden love, there's jealousy, there is, I would say, compulsion or addiction that's explored. There's also some really weird magic. So I think that this maybe also has some slightly less sci-fi elements, if I remember correctly. At the beginning, though, we do resolve things in a really interesting way from book 3. And
Yes.
this book, though, it really stands out for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and say it. This is my number 1 favorite book in the Dark Tower series.
There you go. Wizard and Glass takes Joanna's number 1 spot. Josh,
I don't
are you in agreement?
I don't know if I can add much to that, but yeah, I love Wizard and Glass. And for me, this is the book that Roland Deschain went from one of my favorite Stephen King characters to just one of my favorite characters. I think just learning this story of young Roland and his first fellowship and Cuthbert and Elaine and Susan Delgado. I mean, you learn so much about him as a character. And to me, even though it has so many other elements, this is the one I think back of as being maybe the most traditional kind of fantasy tale, even though it kind of starts with kind of the tail end of what ended the cliffhanger at the Wastelands. But Wizard and Glass for me, it's just a beautiful book. And it's one of those where he finishes that, and I don't know if it was just so good that he didn't know where to go next, and that's why he took 20 years off. But Wizard and Glass, I've read everything by Stephen King, and I did my top 10, and Wizard and Glass was, I think, 4 or 5 on my list. So yeah, it is definitely my number one favorite of the Dark Tower.
Very nice. Well, I was a little bit nervous going into Wizard and Glass. I was like, "You're telling me this is by far the longest book in the series so far, and that a massive chunk of it is a flashback? Oh, this isn't going to go well. This might kill my." Nope, I was wrong. This book is awesome. It nails the Western elements. It nails the romance elements. That's something that I know a lot of us adult sci-fi and fantasy readers can be a bit iffy on, but I thought it was a beautiful love story. And even though it was a big chunk of it was a flashback, I think it did a great job of developing the characters and then also exploring more about the world. I kind of got invested in the universe, in the magic. I thought it was just absolutely fantastic, worth the 900 pages or however long it is. But it's my number two. My number two, I've got one spot to go. What's it going to be? Let's find out as we move on to book number 5 now, Wolves of the Calla. Josh, what are your thoughts?
So, Wolves of the Calla is very interesting because, first of all, you have what I love. I don't think you had read Salem's Lot, but I think it's widely
No.
well known. Yeah, you mentioned that in your review. You hadn't read it, but having been someone who'd read Salem's Lot, I think twice up to that point, seeing this character from Salem's Lot show up in the Dark Tower just reinforced all this multiverse stuff that I loved. So I
Nice.
love that. It almost feels like in Wolves of the Calla that he's just throwing everything in the kitchen sink together, but it works. I think it works. I suspect this might be your favorite because of all of the sci-fi elements in it, and there are some great ones. But this one ended up kind of in the middle for me. But when I say it's ranked fourth of seven, I mean this is still Stephen King, so it's still like an A tier book for me. But yeah, Wolves of the Call end up as my number four.
Interesting. Joanna, where did you land on Wolves of the Calla?
Where did I land on Wolves of the Cause? Okay, so this particular book, I think, has the biggest payoff if you've read Salem's Lot, which I was very, very fortunate to have done before reading this book. Otherwise, I think I would have had a hard time investing in so much backstory with the particular character that we get in this book. Uh, Technology plays a huge role throughout the whole entire series, and you see how it really comes to the forefront in this book. And yes, the kitchen sink metaphor works perfectly to describe this particular book when it comes to the meta stuff as well that's thrown in at the end of the book. I could see how that might be a little bit hit or miss for some readers. For me, I think it worked for the most part. It's very action packed. I understand it's also based on a film, Seven Samurai, which I have not watched, and I think people who are fans of that might enjoy this book for that reason. Um, Also, I would say, well, let's see, where would I rank this? I'm ranking this at number 5 for me. I liked it. I liked it a lot. But yeah, it ranks at number 5.
Interesting. So I agree. There's a lot going on in Wolves of the Calla. In terms of the character from Salem's Lot, I had not read it, but I think King does a good job of sort of explaining that character's backstory, why they're here, how they fit in. So I might not have had as much of an emotional connection to that character as someone that has read Salem's Lot, but I didn't feel like I was missing out or I couldn't understand. King provided enough context for me to sort of get on board with that. And this book has some really cool ideas, but I felt at times it was getting a little bit sidetracked with almost side quests. Like it sort of pitched that, oh, this is the thing that we need to take care of, but first we have to do this, and but then we have to do that. And I was always having a good time reading the book because on a page by page basis, I was still enjoying the characters, I was still enjoying the things that were happening. But when I view it as part of the total story arc, I started to feel the length a little bit more in this one, and there's sort of a confrontation, a big scene at the end, which happened rather quickly. I felt like we got a more satisfying ending in Wizard and Glass. Wolves of the Calla, I still enjoyed, but it wasn't quite on that same level. So I really like this book, but for me, it was also number 5. So that brings us down to the final two books. And if you're thinking ahead by what we rank this, you might be able to tell what we rank with book 7. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Joanna, book 6,
All right.
Song of Susannah.
So I would say up until book 6, we do see that, of course, there's a multiverse concept in the Dark World series, and there are a lot of different worlds that you are noting and different timelines, different periods, different worlds. But I would say that book 6 takes this to a whole new level, and it also takes the meta elements to a whole new level, so we get a lot of bleed with worlds in this book, and that can be very hit or miss for some readers. We also get a storyline that deals with pregnancy and racism and possession, and I actually really enjoyed that storyline. So, I think he took some major risks with this book. Major, major risks. And this one, I don't know. I'm trying to decide if this does seem a little side questy as well. When you were talking about that side quest element, I could see a case for that as well. But actually, I really loved this book. Honestly, I know that's a surprising thing to say.
It's
I
a
actually really
polarizing one.
enjoyed this book, um, despite those things. But it doesn't rank high on my list, unfortunately, because even though I enjoyed my reading experience of this book, I also oddly it's the least emotionally memorable for me. Like I remember certain things about it, but it didn't stay emotionally with me over time, if that makes sense. So, this is hard. I hate doing this. I hate it. But I'm
I'm
gonna give
sorry.
it it's my number 7 ranking. I'm putting it the lowest, but I'm saying that at the same time as I'm saying that I enjoyed this book. And I know a lot of people hate it, but I actually really did enjoy this book, but I still can see, like, for me, it being my least favorite in the series when I look back.
Well, that's a compliment. If number 7 is a book that you liked,
Yeah.
you're in a good spot. Josh, did you like book number 6?
I did. It's I only have 2 numbers left, so it's one or the other, and it's kind of bottom 3 either way, but, um, the thing that I'll say about Song of Susanna is that I don't know if there's another author alive that would have the guts to do what Stephen King did in this book, and I respect that. I didn't love it, but I absolutely respect it, because I don't know if anybody would be bold enough or even if a publisher would let anybody do some of the things that he did in this book. The big one, of course, the big meta tie-in that people if you know, you know. Um, so that's weird. That's out there. The pregnancy thing was weird for me. I think I knew where he was going for it, but yeah, I didn't like that aspect of the book. But I mean, overall, still, it's a King book. I mentioned to somebody on a live stream, and they thought I was crazy. That for me, like when you talk about like a cozy read, for me, it's a Stephen King book. Just because I've read so many and I'm used to his style, and it doesn't matter if it's horror or whatever, it's always like a cozy read for me. So even though I am ranking Song of Susanna 7th, I don't hate the book by any stretch of the imagination.
Interesting. So, yeah, this book takes some big swings, and I think I was semi on board. I liked some of the meta aspects, although I think you have to go on to the next book to see whether they really pay off or not. This is another one of the books in the series that kind of ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. And I think if you were someone that was reading the books at the time, you were waiting years for these books to come out, that might have been more frustrating for you as a reader than for me, who luckily just got to go right on to book number 7. So that didn't impact my reading experience too much. I felt like in this one, some of the magical fantasy elements started to get a little too abstract, a little. If I think of things on the soft to hard end of the sci-fi scale, the magic was is getting pretty soft. It was getting a bit out there, and me, someone that enjoys all types of books on that spectrum, but leans maybe a little bit more towards the hard side, didn't connect with this one quite as much. But I know it's a polarizing one. I'm kind of like you. I liked it more than the haters, but I do agree it's on the lower end of the scale. For me, it was number 6. So that brings us to book 7, The Dark Tower itself. We follow the path of the beam to the ending. Josh, did you like the ending?
So I have to say, there's a lot of revisionist historians out there because when I finished this book, when it came out, I felt like I was the only person I knew that loved the ending. Everybody hated the
Interesting.
ending. All the critics hated the ending. Everybody I talked to that read it hated the ending. And now it seems like most people like the ending. So I think a lot of people have just changed their mind. So I can say, hey,
Mm.
I was right.
Yes.
What I love
You've got
most
the receipts, Josh.
what I love most about the ending is that it caused me to think about the series more than any other book series I'd ever read up to that point. Because so many book series, you get to the end, and how do I say it without a spoiler? You get to the end, and the story's 100% over, and you kind of put that behind you. And in many ways, this one gives you an illusion that, there's still more story to be told. And I love that aspect of it because it made me just, I mean, for at least a year after finishing that book, I thought about that book every day. It's not as
Wow.
much now, but I still think about it probably weekly. And I love the way that he finished it. And of all the book series I've read, that's why it's in my top 5, is because I thought the ending was perfect. I thought it was beautiful. I understand why some people didn't like it, but I respectfully disagree. So it ended up, I mean, the book series is a top 5 for me. As far as the ranking goes, The Dark Tower, the final book, this ended up as my 5th favorite.
Fifth favorite. What high praise for the series? That a book that you thought about daily, for years, weekly, to this very day, was only number 5. That's a good series right there. Joanna, how did you feel about the ending?
Very mixed in some ways because I felt as though several conflicts that occur in the last book, they just they felt like they resolved fairly quickly, and I just didn't quite feel tension in certain scenes. And then there were other parts of this book that just came out of nowhere and hit me emotionally so hard. So there are moments of this book that I still get very emotional thinking about.
Hmm.
And I love the way it's the culmination of so much of what we've seen before. I feel like it, I don't know, at the same time as I feel like some things weren't as strong in the end as far as an ending point, other things I think did reach a really strong peak as far as the themes of the story, and how I think one of the themes that I see throughout this series is compulsion or addiction, or yeah, I would say a compulsive need to get to the dark tower, so to speak. And for me, I felt like there was also instances of sacrifice, and so I liked that counterpoint between compulsion and sacrifice that's throughout this book, and that's what got to me so much emotionally. A part of me loves this book, and then part of me feels a little let down here and there. So it's a very I'm very conflicted about it. It might be the book that makes me the most emotional in some ways too. So I don't know how to reconcile all that except to say that I did place this as number 4. And I think that the ending was, for me, maybe not the strongest ending. Part of that could have been that I was spoiled for this ending many years before, but I didn't remember
Interesting.
what I was told. I just remember hearing about it. So maybe that played a role, but I still think the ending worked. So I think it worked. So it's number 4 on my list.
There you go. Well, I think there's a couple of different elements of this book which hit or didn't hit in different ways. And that is, you have the narrative threads, you had my emotional reaction, and then sort of thematically tying up everything that the Dark Tower was supposed to be. When it comes to some of the narrative threads, I think there are some things which people might rightfully say this was a bit anticlimactic, or this came out of nowhere, or this happened too quickly. And I don't care about any of it because the emotional highs were so high. I think this book made me cry like 4 times. I think the ending to this book is absolutely perfect. It's summed up everything that the Dark Tower wanted to be, could have been. I don't know if anybody other than Stephen King could have done it. It's so uniquely Stephen King while being a love letter to literature itself. I think it's so ambitious in terms of being inspired by different genres and time periods and writers, and yet it's a uniquely individual story that came from this mad genius, Stephen King. So there's a bunch of stuff I'm like, why would you do that? That makes no sense. I don't care. It's a flawed masterpiece. It's still a 10 out of 10. If you make me cry 4 times, you get a 10 out of 10. That's how the Jonathan rating system works. This was my number 1. I loved it.
Love it.
I love it. I didn't see all that coming. I was so scared when you decided to read this series based on my recommendation because I did get like Westworld vibes at times. I did feel like there were some sci-fi elements, a little bit of time travel here and there, multiverse stuff, but I was still unsure whenever you committed to it. I thought, "Oh no, did I steer him wrong? Is he going to be disappointed?"
No,
Oh, I'm
not at
so
all,
thrilled to
John.
hear
Not at
that.
all.
I'm so thrilled to hear that. I love what you shared too. That's a perfect reason to rank this as your favorite book in the series too.
I think I'm learning about myself that the higher the high point, the more forgiving I am of low points. Because like The Fall of Hyperion is one of my all-time favorite books. I think I ranked it number 4 on my top 25 sci-fi books of all time list. And there's stuff like that in similarly where I'm like, why did you do that? What a strange end to that thread. But I just don't care. I'll fight to the death that The Fall of Hyperion is a 10 out of 10 because of the high points. And yeah, I'd never heard these two series compared before, but I actually think there's a lot of similarity in terms of the ambitiousness,
Yeah.
the influence of literature, the melding of so many subgenres, stylistically different writers, but I think there's elements of Hyperion and the Dark Tower which might cross over, and they did for me. So maybe they'll cross
They
over for other
are.
people
That's a
too.
really good
Yeah.
comparison because and both authors love their literary allusions.
Yes.
Love it. Yes, I actually think that's a really good comparison, at least with the first book, Hyperion, which is the only one I've read so far.
And I think both authors, having read, I've read everything by King. I've read 6 or 7 by Simmons at this point, and both authors just blur genre so well. And
Yes.
but yeah, I think that Simmons was influenced by King. I really believe that in many ways.
I would
Yeah.
suspect so. I know Josh quite liked the Fall of Hyperion. That's another polarizing book, so we
I
welcome you,
I
Joanna.
loved all 4 of those Hyperion books, and I love how actually it's very much similar to Dark Tower. All 4 of those books are 100% different. You could place them almost in different subgenres of sci-fi that I love. So, Joanna, you'll get there. You'll love it.
I will. I just recently read Hyperion and I loved it, and I do plan to continue with Fall of Hyperion at some point. So I will let you all know.
I'll reserve a spot on Team Fall for you. I'll save a seat. Well, there you go. Those are our rankings. I feel like we were generally in similar areas. Maybe I was a little bit higher on the ending than you guys, but I feel like yeah, we had some similar lists. But
Yeah.
maybe you guys in the comments, you guys, the audience, you're gonna have to put your ranking in the comments. Let us know what you agree, disagree with. What did we underrate or overrate? It's such a unique series, so I'm sure different books will appeal to different people. You got to let us know your ranking. And there we go. We did it. I think we did a good job. Go check out Josh's channel. Go check out Joanna's channel. And go read The Dark Tower. We all liked it. We all thought it was great. Joanna, any closing comments?
Oh, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. It's just reminding me how much I love this series, and I'm just so happy that you enjoyed it. That's the biggest reward ever. And of course, it's a pleasure to talk with Josh here, who is a huge King fan and somebody I look up to for his King recommendations.
Awesome. Love it. Josh,
Well,
any
speaking
any
of King
advice for the constant
recommendations,
readers?
Jonathan, I have one for you. I think
Ooh,
your next Stephen King book should be 11/22/63, which is
I'm on
Yes,
board.
has time travel, so it could be technically be sci-fi, and it is my favorite Stephen King novel.
mine too, right
Wow.
now,
Oh,
with
there
those
you
few that
go.
I've read.
Yeah.
Hey, 11/11/22, 63, rocketing up the TBR as we speak.
Yes, great recommendation, Josh. I back that up.
Just as you guys said, rocket on over to the like and subscribe button. Go check out Josh and Joanna's channels. Sci-fi, fantasy, western, horror. Look at us coming together, part of the BookTube community. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one.